an event that shaped the world. She said, I was about 4 years old the first time I ever saw what happened when you acted up to whites. I was standing in line at the general store when this little white boy cut in front of me. Then some older white kids came in through the door and started laughing. I turned around to see what they were laughing at, and they were pointing at me. The little boy said, let me see. Let me see too. For some reason, they all wanted to see my hands. I held up my hands, palms up, and he put his hands up against my hands. He touched them. The older kids doubled up, laughing. My mother saw us, and she saw that the boy's mother was watching. Then my mom came straight across the room, raised her hand, and gave me a backhand slap across the face. I burst into tears. She said, don't you know you're not supposed to touch them? The white boy's mother nodded at my mom and said, that's right, Mary. That's how I learned I should never touch another white person again. That happened in Montgomery, Alabama in about 1943. Claudette was a bright girl with a squeaky voice. She was small for her age and was being raised by her aunt and uncle. Her parents had never married. To understand what happened to Claudette next, we need to understand what Montgomery, Alabama was like in those days. So half of the population was black and half of the population was white. It was pretty close to equal. And black income was half of what white income was. So two men working in a factory, one white would be making twice as much as the one black. And 3 out of 5 women in that community worked as domestics in white households. That meant that they were cooks, they were maids, they were nannies. Sometimes all of those things wrapped into one. So they spent most of their waking hours caring for other people's family and not their own. And the thing is that neighborhoods were separated. There were black neighborhoods on one side and white neighborhoods on the other side. And they were separated by train tracks. Has the mic gone out again? Okay. Thank you. And they were separated by train tracks. So it was really dangerous and time consuming to get from one side to the other. So for a lot of the black folk, and of course, I mean, you imagine how this goes, right? The further away you live from the train tracks, the more money you have. So people far away from the train tracks hired people far away from the train tracks on the other side to work in their houses. So because they made half of what white people made, the black folks absolutely needed the buses to get across town. They needed the buses in order to live. Now, the law at that time was that white people sat in the front of the bus. They came in, they paid, they sat down. But black people had to sit in the back, and they had to come onto the bus, pay, go back out, and go in the back door to sit in the back seats. So you can imagine what would happen sometimes, right? The bus driver, after somebody would pay and get out, the bus would just leave. Now, by law, if the white section was full and a white person came in, they'd have to stand. The white section was full. But the bus drivers had a lot of power. In fact, some people say that they had as much power as the police had. And so the practice in Montgomery was that if the white section was full and one white person came in, the bus driver would yell, I need a seat. And that meant the whole first row of black people had to stand up and move back so that one person could take that entire row. One white person could take that entire row. Now, Philip Hoos, who wrote a biography about Claudette Colvin, called riding the bus a necessary humiliation. And that's what young Claudette went through. Because like everybody else, she rode the bus. She rode the bus every single day. And she was little, and she had a squeaky voice, and she was smart. She asked a lot of questions, a lot of good questions. It's kind of like a lot of the kids here in our congregation. It's also important to know that there were two other things going on at the same time. The Supreme Court had just made a decision in the Brown versus Board of Education case, and that meant that across the United States, including in Montgomery, Alabama, all the schools would be desegregated. So black children and white children, for the first time ever in the South, would be learning together in the same classrooms. Now, a lot of Claudette's classmates who didn't love school as much as she did said, well, I don't want to go to school with white people. I don't want to go to school with the devil. And at the same time, she had a classmate who was a year ahead of her, whose name was Jeremiah Reeves. And he was only 16 years old, and he was arrested for assaulting a white woman. And the police forced him to confess, even though he didn't do it. And he was sentenced to death. Now, the whole community was angry and afraid. But Claudette fumed. She could feel it in her bones. Her anger was coming out of her ears. And she didn't know what to do with that anger. So she went to two of her favorite teachers, Miss Lawrence, who taught history, and Miss Nesbitt, who taught English. And the two of them decided that they were going to do something that had never been done before. They had Black History Month. They studied history of black folks in their community, all across the United States and in Africa. And Claudette learned just how powerful they were. And in that process, she also learned what the real law was in Montgomery on those buses. She learned that if she was in the black section, she didn't have to give up her seat to a white person who came in. So on the way home from school that day, when the bus driver yelled, "I need a seat," the other kids in the row with her got up, but Claudette didn't. She stayed sitting right there because she knew what the law was. But she was very polite about it. The bus driver kept yelling at her to move, and she said, "No, sir, I understand the law and I don't have to move." So he radioed for police, and at the next stop, they got in the bus. And they yelled at Claudette. They called her the most horrible names you can imagine. And she remained polite. And she said, "No, sir, I understand the law." And they grabbed her and they threw her in a police car, which scared her because if there's one thing she knew is you never let yourself be alone with white men. But they arrested her. Her parents had to come and bail her out. And at school the next day, she was a hero. All the rest of those kids in that black school, they loved her for what she did because she stood up. And she inspired a lot of people in that community, including a young minister who was the new pastor of the little Dexter Avenue Baptist Church across town. And his name was Martin Luther King Jr. And she also inspired somebody named Rosa Parks, who had a full-time job but also worked as a secretary at the NAACP. And can you imagine little Claudette Colvin with her squeaky voice started a movement because those people decided what they needed to do was boycott the bus system in Montgomery to create change. Claudette changed history. That's what young people can do when they hold on to what they know is right. I kind of lucked out on Thursday Adria secured a seat for me at a talk that was sponsored by the North Kingstown Public Library, a talk by Tim Cranston, who is a local historian and author with deep roots in Rhode Island. He traces his roots back to the Mayflower, and a relative of his, an ancestor of his, is the person after whom the city of Cranston was named. I was kind of surprised when I saw him, because he's kind of short, he's got dark hair and a white mustache, big bushy mustache, that's a chevron, like a walrus. And he was wearing a sweater and kind of old jeans. He was a real swamp Yankee. I love that term, swamp Yankee. I never knew that till I got to Rhode Island. He started off talking about the Pilgrims and their relationship with the Wampanoag people, and how what we were taught in school, especially in elementary school, about the way they were friends with each other and supported each other and came together for this wonderful Thanksgiving dinner celebration, was an exaggeration, actually a myth. And he also talked about Roger Williams and how Roger Williams had talked about and wrote about admiring the Narragansett people. And we've come to think of him as being a great friend to the Narragansett, but again, kind of a myth, kind of a exaggeration, because even though he wrote about admiring the Narragansetts, he didn't really trust them. He kind of thought they'd pull one over on him at the second he didn't look away. And then Tim moved on to the next part of the story of colonization. He talked about slavery in Rhode Island. He reminded me that the state was, until pretty recently, called the state of Rhode Island and Providence Plantations. And I thought about when I first moved to Providence, oh my God, 40 years ago now. I learned how those plantations extended from what's now Main Street all the way to the Seekonk River, which is more than a mile. They were huge plantations. And there were also, a little later, textile mills that were growing up, not only in Pawtucket, but in Woonsocket and Central Falls and all over the state of Rhode Island. And those plantations and those textile mills needed something to make them financially viable. And that was the free labor of enslaved people. Then he went on to talk about a few numbers that I didn't know. 2/3 of all of the slaves who were shipped through and into the United States came through ports in Rhode Island. Can you imagine that 2/3 of the entire colonial slave trade came through this little state? And of those 2/3 who came through, 1/3 of them ended up staying here in Rhode Island. So this tiny little state with its small population was a disproportionately large number of slaveholders. I had no idea about those numbers because, if we're honest, we who grew up in the northern states, especially here in New England, we're taught that slavery wasn't so bad here, right? That our forebears were the good slaveholders. And that the enslaved were happier here than in the South, where it was much, much worse. But owning human beings and treating them as chattel is never good, right? So we covered the truth. But the thing is, and Tim talked about this, when we cover up the truth, we create secrets. And those secrets become the poison that makes us sick as a culture. So his talk was a reminder that we have to keep thinking critically. When it comes to understanding our history, especially as it relates to colonization and enslavement, we must keep asking questions again and again and again. Why did that happen? Who gained power or great wealth in the process? Who was subjugated in the process? Why were certain laws passed, and whom did they protect? Who were the victors? Who were the authors of history? And what were they hiding? What stories are not being told? What voices are being silenced? Now, I don't know about you, but as a critical thinker, I've had a lot of conversations with people over the year about slavery in America and colonization, especially conversations about the first Thanksgiving. Conversations with people whose beliefs are more rooted than mine in the mythology of American exceptionalism. I'll say something to these folks like, the relationship between the Wampanoag and the Pilgrims wasn't as cozy and trusting as we were led to believe in elementary school. It's shocking how often that will be met with some retort like, yeah, exactly. A lot of history that we're taught just isn't true. Take Rosa Parks. And she wasn't a little old lady on her way home from work who was just tired and couldn't give up her seat. She was a middle-class, well-educated woman. And that whole event, that was planned, that was staged. Val, you look shocked. You've never heard that before? Like, I've heard people say that. I've heard that a lot. The thing is that on November 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on the bus in Montgomery, and her forceful removal launched the Montgomery bus boycott, which propelled Martin Luther King Jr. into the national spotlight almost overnight. It was amazing how fast a slowly growing movement became so real, so visible for so many people who had been blind to it in a way, up to that point. You know, and in a way, the naysayers, the people who talk about the whole thing being staged, they're kind of right, because it was all planned. The thing is that her action had to be planned. Up until that point, there were a lot of people who were arrested. Hundreds of people just in Montgomery. It was a regular thing where they'd refuse to give up a seat because they knew the law. They'd get hauled away by the police, booked. They'd have a criminal record. One of the most famous cases, and this was happening not just in Montgomery, this was happening all over the United States. And one of the most famous cases is Frederick Douglass. If you're a listener of the local public radio station, you've heard these little blips in the last few days between programming about how Frederick Douglass was arrested on a train from Boston to Lexington. And that wasn't the only time. He was arrested dozens of times. And he even talks about being so angry, so forceful one time on a trip to Lynn that he just about tore out all the seats on the train on his way out. And that wasn't how Claudette Colvin reacted, was it? And the thing is that her family believed that because she was so polite and so meek and so sweet, because she didn't resist arrest, that everything was okay. They really believed that there was a strong likelihood that the KKK would show up and burn their house down that night, because that was often how her kind of arrest was met. But they thought if they could make it through those first few nights, they would be okay because she was calm. She was polite. The thing is that even though the KKK didn't show up that night, her case went to court. She was convicted. This 15-year-old girl had a criminal record as if she were an adult. And after that court case, she returned to school. And even though she'd been a hero up until that point, suddenly she was labeled a troublemaker. And her friends stayed away from her. They unfriended her. So there are a few lessons from Claudette, even after all this time. First of all, the lesson on nonviolent resistance. You know, she did what just came naturally for her. She was tiny. She had this squeaky voice. She knew she couldn't stand up to these big white police officers with billy clubs and guns. So she just went limp and was compliant in the arrest. But that sparked a memory in Martin Luther King Jr. He remembered about Gandhi and his lessons of nonviolence protest in the liberation movement in India. And that in turn got him to enlist the help of his friend Bayard Rustin, who was an expert in that field. And so as the Montgomery bus boycott grew, they used those lessons. They taught people remain calm, stay silent, and that is what set the tone for a peaceful revolution. And because King and Rustin and even Gandhi from afar became part of this movement, it taught everybody that nobody can do this alone, and it can't be just the local black community. They needed the whole nation in on this. They needed white people in on this. They learned that you need to count on people you may not know, people you may not even fully trust, in order to create change and protect you from violent retribution. They learned that if a meek 15-year-old with a squeaky voice could show up and show such resolve, any of us can do it. So Rosa Parks and the rest of the black leadership in Montgomery knew that Claudette wouldn't get attention or create change on her own. She was too young. Her family was too poor. And most of all, she was not respectable because her parents were not married to each other. Community leaders knew that it was more likely that the world of white people with power would see the injustice if it were perpetrated against someone like Rosa Parks. She was the kind of person that could bring attention to an injustice that happened all the time, especially if the cameras and the reporters were there. And it got attention, global attention. For the first time, a local arrest of a black person got national attention. The winners of the conflicts, the people with all the power, can change the ways in which stories get told so that they look better, right? We call that whitewashing. Whitewashing of history has literally disappeared the stories of people like Claudette Colvin and turned people like Rosa Parks into some kind of conspirator in mass manipulation devised to make white people look bad, right? That's the theory. That's the point of whitewashing, to eliminate those kinds of stories. But the thing is, their stories were real, and they both had the courage to risk their lives. Talking now about the stories of Claudette Colvin and Rosa Parks is exposing layers of history. That's why I'm really glad that this story about Claudette Colvin is really getting national attention. So last month, this is one of those left-hand turns that I talk about all the time. Last month, Jean Arthur and Kathy Solomon created this work of art to bring attention, to illustrate their interpretation of our January theme, which is liberating love. But this work of art, like all good art, is open to interpretation of the viewer, right? And in light of today's subject, I can't help seeing it through that lens, interpreting it through the lens of Claudette Colvin. So this piece is really layered, right? It started with green and purple and blue, and they were all kind of muddled together in this cloudy, sort of ethereal, cosmic kind of way that made me feel like, well, this is about the unity and the mystery of the cosmos. And then on top of that got added a yellow spiral that reminded me of the symbol that weather forecasters use for hurricanes, right? And it made me think of how we're in a storm, right? I could use a colorful four-letter word to describe the kind of storm that we're in, and that yellow spiral represented that. But then on top of that, there were all these beautiful orbs. They were spheres and ovals that seemed to pop off the painting three-dimensionally. And it reminded me that we're all in this together. We may look like we're each individual things, but we're all here in this beautiful, multicolored, layered cosmos. And sometimes we're as we're moving around, we're bumping into each other. And on the fourth week, all of that imagery was covered with white in the negative space to create the image of these two peace. I see them as doves of peace flying toward the sky. And to me, this piece is a representation of our job as people who care about justice and equity, engaged with history, even as it's unfolding. It's a reminder to me that our job is to peel back the layers of history to see what is happening underneath the surface, that which may be covered over but is not lost. It's a reminder to me to make sure that that kind of whitewashing of history isn't repeated again. This artwork to me is a reminder that our job is to think like artists, to think critically, to be constantly asking why, to listen to children when they put their lives in harm's way, to support and protect them, to be there when our neighbors, people of African, Latino, and Asian descent, immigrants, queer people, women are at risk, to believe their experience, to listen to their stories, and most importantly, to engage in critical thinking, the drive to keep asking why over and over again until the truth is exposed. Whenever we're in a group of people with the most power, whenever we are part of that power, like the people who are white, middle class or wealthy, able-bodied, heterosexual, cisgendered, male, we need to be mindful of that power, because our job is to make sure that we are the kinds of artists of life who don't whitewash history in order to make ourselves feel better. We owe Claudette Colvin and Rosa Parks more than that. Maybe so. So please rise now, if you will, and open your hymnal.